Hello, I'm Philip Mugglestone, and in this series of videos we're covering the R integration for SAP HANA. In this video we're going to look more at the installation and configuration of R integration for SAP HANA. Now I'm going to point you to where you can find the documentation and the manual for the R integration, which is always a good document to have at hand. We'll also look a little bit more about the architecture. And we'll establish how you can see whether or not the R integration is already available, and if not, then we'll look at the three-step process that's needed in order to make the R integration available. In fact, what we'll be looking at is installing R on a Linux server. The R integration for SAP HANA is supported on SUSE Linux Enterprise Server version 11 SP1. It's actually the same as HANA. However, you should not install R on your HANA server. It should be on a separate server. We don't at SAP support R on the HANA server at this point in time. So you would need a Linux server where you would install R itself, and then as part of R there is a package known as rserve, and you would need to install that package rserve in your R environment. And then finally you need to make a little bit of configuration with HANA. That's something we would do with HANA Studio to actually just tell HANA where it can find this R server. And then potentially you could actually have a number of different R servers, and then HANA will be able to talk to all of them. So you have some potential for scaling and also for high availability. So now I'm logged in to my Windows client, and the first thing I want to do is to just identify the documentation. So let's go to the help.sap.com/HANA_appliance. We've seen this before. This is where we can download all of the main documentation for HANA. And in the development area, under development information, we'll see that we have a document here called a SAP HANA R Integration Guide. And it's this document that has everything you need to know around running the R integration for SAP HANA. So we can download that, and I recommend that you have that available to you at all times. It's very useful. It has a lot of very good information about how to use. It has examples. It has how to do some of the installation and configuration, etc., and also some debugging information. So highly recommend that you make sure you have this document available. Now we've seen the documentation, the next step would be to verify whether or not R is available to us. So we can open HANA Studio, and for our server, in this case HDB, we can bring up the admin console, and in there, if we go to the configuration tab as a system user, we can just search on some configuration items. If we type in CER, which we'll see later refers to Calculation Engine R integration, CER underscore, we see we don't have any items existing. So this is basically saying that this HANA server is not currently configured to work with R. Another way you could do that would be go to the index server ini and then look at the Calc engine and see what values you have for Calc engine, because that's actually where, when we do configure this, we're going to put three parameters which begin or have CER underscore in them. So we can see that R is not available currently to this server. It's not already configured. We can't use it right now. So what we would want to then do is to identify our R server. Now, just to save time, I've already got a Linux server set up which we can use for R. It's just a raw Linux server at this point. I've got the IP address and I've got a name, r.cloud.sap.corp. Notice that this is not the same server as your HANA server. Even though it's SUSE Linux 11 SP1, it's physically not the same server as the HANA server. So R needs to run on its own dedicated server in your data center. So we can connect to this R server, or this Linux server. We can do that, for example, by configuring PuTTY. So let's go and connect to, as root user, to our R server. And once we're there, we may want to establish, for example, whether R itself has actually been installed yet. So an easy way to do that is just use the which command, which R, And we run that, and it basically doesn't find an R command at all. It looks in all the binary directories and folders. It doesn't find R, so basically that's a good sign that R has not been installed. We have a vanilla Linux machine, so it's now for us to actually think about how we can install and configure R on that and make it available to work with HANA. So we're going to need to install R. Now the first thing we should do before downloading and starting that process, we need to verify some prerequisites. Now there are a couple of ways you can do that. One of them is to use the RPM for the package manager command and basically do a query to see if these three packages already exist. In many Linux environments they're already there. So it's the Xorg X11 development, the Fortran environment, and also readline development. So we can run that command and we see that all three of those have been installed, they exist, and we can see their version numbers. Now another way that you could do that, depending on your system, would be, for example, to run YAST, and within the YAST control center we can go to software and use the software management tool. And again, if we were to use the software manager tool, we'd be able to filter on the packages that we were looking at. So if we recall, the first one was second one was GCC Fortran. We could search on that, and we see that GCC Fortran package is installed. If not, then it's probably from here in YAST that you would actually go and do that installation. The other prerequisites were Xorg X11 development. So we can search Xorg. There we see X11 develop. Okay, that one's installed. And the third one was readline development. So let's just go to readline, search on that, and we see readline devel, that package is installed. So all three prerequisite packages, this is highlighted in the R integration for SAP HANA documentation. All three of those packages are installed and working, so we're in good shape. Now whilst we're here in YAST, one further thing that we could do would be to install a user and a group to reflect our usage of R. So for that one we can go to the security and users and user and group management. Let's just maximize the window. Okay, so we want to create a new group, so let's choose add, or new user, I'm sorry, and we're going to maybe call this user R user, for the user of R. We'll give him a secure password. Okay, and okay, so that creates us our user. And for our test environment, we can use a relatively simple password. You should use a harder one for production environments. Also, we're going to create a group of users. So we're going to add a group. We can call this our users. And in that group, we're going to add our new R user. Okay, so we can create that group. It's done. So now we've created a user and a group that we're going to work with R. So we're now in good shape with our users and groups. We can save that. We can close YAST. And now we can start to look at how we actually get the R software. And in some Linux installations, then you get R included. However, if you need to, you can always download it from the open source mirrors where you would install R itself. So that's what I'm going to do here. In fact, I'm going to run a wget command, and here I'm pointing to one of the mirrors, a local mirror for me, which has got the R version, which we can download for Linux. So we're using version 2.15. The R integration for SAP HANA requires that you have at least 2.13, but 2.15 is a good version to be using. And this download is going to take a couple of minutes, so let's just let that run. So now the download is completed, and the next step is for us to actually unpack this tar file. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to unpack that to our local directory, and now we can start the process of actually compiling. We need to make this. So the first thing we would do is to actually move into the directory we just created when we unpacked, and then we need to run a configure command. Again, you'll find the details for this in the documentation. So we run our /configure, and the configure has now completed. And now the next thing we need to is actually to compile. We need to do a make So we're going to run make clean first, and let's run that. That's going to take a couple of minutes, so we'll leave that to run. Now our make clean has run, we need to run a regular make. So this is now using the GCC Fortran compiler, and it's going to compile the R for us on this server. Now this will take several minutes to run. So the make is now completed, and the final thing we need to do is run a make install. So we'd run a make install, and that will take a couple of minutes as well. Now that the install has run, we can do a little bit of cleanup. So let's just go back one level of directory, and let's remove that installation directory that we have. So we use the rm command with the recursive and force option. It's going to remove many of those files to save space. Now you may remember that a couple of minutes ago we in fact created a user that we want to work with R. So what we're now going to do is, for the actual R libraries that have been set up in user local lib64, for example, and also in user local bin, we're going to change the ownership of those to our new R user and use that group, which was R users. So we're going to use the change ownership command. First we'll do it for user local bin /R, and we're also going to change the ownership for the local user local lib64R. So let's do that one as well. Here we go, user local lib64R. So we change the ownership on those two. Now we can actually log in effectively super user as our R user, and we can start to perform some operations as that R user. Now the first thing that we want to be able to do is in fact to get the software, the rserve software, which is a package, it's an optional package for R, which is rserve is what we will use to communicate between HANA and R. So I can do a wget to the mirror on the CRAN's R source project library, which actually will get us the latest version of the rserve tar file. So we'll let that download. We now have the R file, so the next thing is actually for us to start R. So that with a capital R, we'll actually start the R application. Okay, so R is up and running, version 2.15, and we need to install that new package that we just created, or downloaded. So to do that, we can simply point to the file that we just downloaded. So we're in the R user, so we use the home directory, that's where we are, and we can just point to that tar file and use R itself to install that optional package. Now the package installs in just a few seconds. Now we can actually exit R, and to do that we use the Q command with parentheses, and we can just say yes. Okay, so now we've come out of R, and we're finished with what we're doing for that specific user right now. So now as the root user, what we need to do is create a config file for rserve. And one of the things we'll put in there is the amount of memory we want R to be able to use. So the first thing you should do, if you're not already fully aware, is to identify how many bytes of memory you have available. So you can use the free command and with the B option to give it in bytes. And we can see here we have this number of bytes available. You divide that number by 2048, which in this case gives about 738 7389910. That gives us our number. That's the value we're going to use in a moment for the input buffer. Okay, so we can use the VI editor to create our config file. It needs to be in the etc folder, and it's called rserve.conf, and that's case sensitive. And we can input. Now the first one is the max in buffer, and for that we need to put the value, which was this memory divided by in bytes divided by 2048, which in our case is 7389910. And then the next thing I want to do is we need to put in something called the max send buff, which we can put in here. For that we can set it to 0, unlimited. We also need to say remote enable, Okay, that's basically all we need to do. We can now escape and save that file. Okay, we also need to make sure that the R user who runs rserv will have access to this file, needs read access. So for that we can do a change mod command to give the read access to that user. So let's just run a change mod plus R to give read access to the users for that file. So now we're ready to in fact start the rserv. Now that's something we need to do with a specific command that's highlighted in the manual, and there are a couple of options in there, but we need to do that as the R user. That's going to be the one. So let's super user back to the R user. So we're now logged in again as the R user. Now what we need to do to start rserv is to issue a command. The command looks something like this. It's the R command followed by cmd in capitals and then rserv, because that's the package we want to start. We need to specify a port number. In this case we've chosen port 30020, but that can be any port that you want to use for rserv. And then we have a couple of other options, including UTF-8 encoding. You'll find more on all of these options in the reference guide. But anyway, let's start rserv. So now rserv is up and running. Now if we want that to be done automatically, for example, every time we reboot the system, then you can use a cron job to do that. Otherwise it's up to you to go and start rserv, or the administrator of the system to start rserv as and when needed. So we've got rserv now running. R is going to be available for HANA to use. So the next step is to actually go and configure HANA to actually communicate with this rserv instance. So we're going to see that in the next video.